The problem with travelling halfway around the world was that, eventually, you had to come home to yourself. 10 days in Japan and Zara Thompson still hadn't fixed herself. She'd tried. She'd done the temples, the ones that asked you to remove your shoes at the threshold and breathe the incense-heavy air and stand still while the world outside kept moving. She'd done long walks through Kyoto at 6 in the morning when the streets were quiet enough that you could hear your own footsteps on the stone and pretend, briefly, that you were someone who had figured things out. She'd even bought a ceramic bowl she didn't need. Matte grey, irregular at the rim, the kind of imperfect beautiful thing that sat in your palm like it had been waiting for you. She'd carried it wrapped in tissue all the way from the shop, and she'd sat in a moss garden for 2 hours doing nothing. No phone, no music, just her and the bowl and the sound of water somewhere she couldn't see, which her therapist would have called progress. But somewhere between Osaka and the airport, the feeling had come back. The quiet one. The one that lived just below the noise of being fine. Not grief exactly. Not loneliness exactly. Something more like a low, persistent hum, the kind you only notice when everything else goes still. "You're doing the face," Sophie said. They were in the departures hall at Haneda, cases at their feet, coffees in hand, surrounded by the white noise of an airport doing what airports do, announcements in 2 languages, the distant mechanical sigh of luggage belts, families and business travellers, and exhausted tourists all moving in that slow drift that builds before a gate opens. Sophie was watching her with the particular expression of a friend who has known you long enough to read the things you don't say out loud. "I don't have a face," Zara said. "You have a face. It's the Andrew face." "It's not the Andrew face. Andrew and I ended 4 months ago. I'm over it." Sophie said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Zara looked away, out at the glass wall of the departures hall and the grey tarmac beyond it. She was over it, or she was over him at least. What she wasn't over was the feeling that had come after. That quiet, unwelcome calculation she kept doing at 1 in the morning, in the dark, when the rational part of her brain had gone offline and left only the part that kept score. 29. Every relationship ending the same way, with the same polite unravelling, the same careful speeches about timing and direction. Another man who had looked at her life and decided it didn't quite fit into his. She'd deleted every dating app before the trip. Not because of Andrew specifically. It was never about one person. It was the accumulation, the swiping, the small talk, the first dates that went fine, the second dates that went fine, then the slow fade that came after and somehow still managed to sting every single time, no matter how much you told yourself it wouldn't. One morning she'd woken up at 7, grey light coming in through the curtains, and she'd opened her phone and looked at the grid of hopeful strangers, all of them smiling in good light, all of them holding a dog or standing on a mountain. And she'd felt nothing except tired. So she'd deleted them, all of them in a row, methodically, like clearing a drawer you'd been meaning to sort for years. Japan was supposed to help, and it had. Mostly. She drank her coffee. It had gone slightly cold. "Gates open," Sophie said. The queue had been moving for about 4 minutes when the gate agent stepped forward. She had the particular expression of someone who has been trained to deliver inconvenient news with warmth, the smile that meant "I need something from you and I'm hoping you're the generous type." The flight was overbooked, she explained. A family, 2 parents, 3 children, one of them actively crying with the full-bodied commitment only a small child can manage, needed seats together. The current configuration didn't allow for it. Was there anyone, she asked, voice carrying over the queue with practised calm, who might consider taking the following morning's flight? A pause. The kind that fills with the sound of people hoping someone else will step forward. Sophie's connection to Edinburgh meant she couldn't. She gave Zara a look that was equal parts guilt and relief. Zara looked at the crying child, looked at the gate agent, thought about the 11-hour flight home and her middle seat, and the fact that she had nowhere to be tomorrow that couldn't wait. "What do I get?" she said. What she got was a suite. Not a seat, a suite. Its own door, like a room within the plane. A bed that unfolded completely flat, dressed in actual cotton with the weight of something you might find in a good hotel. A menu that read like an exhibition catalogue. Small dishes with long descriptions. Wine pairings annotated in a careful hand. Champagne before she'd sat down, pressed into her palm by a flight attendant who seemed genuinely pleased for her. She photographed her boarding pass and sent it to Sophie before she'd cleared security. Sophie sent back 16 fire emojis and a voice note that was mostly just screaming. She looked at the champagne in her hand, cold and precise and slightly fizzing, and thought, "I volunteered my seat because a toddler was crying, and the universe gave me a bed in the sky." She didn't know what that meant about karma or fate or any of it. She just knew she was going to sleep for 11 hours and land at Heathrow a different woman. She was in a good mood for the first time in weeks. Then she noticed the man in the suite beside her. She noticed him the way you notice something at the edge of vision. Not quite a decision to look, more like an awareness that settles before you've consciously named it. A tall frame, folding itself into the adjacent suite with the kind of unhurried economy that suggested he'd done this many times and required nothing from the experience except the experience itself. There was no exploratory theatre, no looking around at the fittings, no testing the seat, no asking the attendant what was available. Coat folded once and placed with precision in the overhead compartment. Bag stowed below, seat adjusted with 2 touches. All of it done with the self-possession of someone who had long since stopped noticing where they were. Zara noticed, against her will, that he was extraordinarily good-looking. Not in the way that announced itself. Not the kind of face that walked into a room and waited for the room to respond. It was more unsettling than that. The kind of beauty that didn't ask for anything, which made it impossible to dismiss. He was tall in the way that read across a space, with the lean, assembled quality of someone whose body had never been decorative, only functional. His jaw was clean-edged and precise, his features carrying a symmetry that felt almost architectural, the kind of face a sculptor would have been quietly pleased with. Dark eyes beneath darker brows, his expression at rest holding none of the careful approachability that most people wore in public. No performance of warmth, no social softening, just a face, doing nothing, being devastating about it. And when he'd passed her in the narrow aisle on his way to stow his bag, she'd caught his scent without meaning to. Something warm and unhurried, sandalwood and something drier beneath it. Cedar maybe, or vetiver. The kind of fragrance that didn't arrive before a person and didn't linger long after them, but existed in the small radius of their presence like a quiet fact. She'd breathed it in without deciding to. She'd looked at her hands immediately afterwards as though that might help. His phone was open to what looked like a financial document, dense columns, Korean characters interspersed with numbers, and he was reading it with a quality of focus that made the rest of the cabin feel slightly beside the point. He did not look up. Zara looked away, with the specific discipline of a woman who had deleted every dating app and meant it. Fine. She had a flat bed and a 5-course menu and 11 hours of airspace between herself and her life. She didn't need to notice anything. She ordered the tasting menu. The first course arrived, something with citrus and a sauce reduced to a glossy thread across white porcelain, and she was just lifting her fork when the attendant leaned across to adjust the partition between the sweets, which had come slightly loose in its fitting. It knocked once against the man's tray table. He looked up from his document. The attendant apologised. He made a brief, unbothered gesture that meant it doesn't matter in any language, and then, as though compelled by some minor gravitational force, his gaze moved, just for a second, to Zara. She had the fork halfway to her mouth. She lowered it. She was close enough now to see that his eyes weren't simply dark. They were the deep, considered brown of old wood, lit from within by something watchful and intelligent and not unkind. He looked at her the way people rarely looked at each other in public, directly, without apology, without performance, as though he'd simply decided to, and that was sufficient. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It felt considerably longer. "Sorry," the attendant murmured and stepped away. The partition settled, the moment closed. "The citrus one is good," he said. His voice was low, not quiet by nature, but quiet by choice, the kind of voice that knew it didn't need to fill a room. It moved through her in the way that certain sounds do, not heard so much as felt, landing somewhere just below the sternum. "Is it?" she said, because apparently that was all she had. The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, something more private, something that suggested he found the world occasionally, mildly amusing, and saw no need to share the joke more widely. "The rest of the menu is also good," he said. "I've had it before." "You fly this route a lot?" "Often enough." And then he returned to his document, easy, unhurried, as though the conversation had been sufficient and he required nothing further, from her or from anyone. Zara turned back to her food and took the bite she'd been postponing. He was right. The citrus one was good. She resented him slightly for it. Somewhere over Russia she fell asleep. She woke 2 hours later, needing the bathroom. The cabin had dimmed to almost nothing while she slept, just the faint blue underglow of the aisle lighting and the occasional pale rectangle of a screen where someone else couldn't sleep either. She moved quietly, the way people do in shared dark spaces, and made her way to the rear of the cabin. She was on her way back when she saw him. He was standing in the aisle just ahead of her, up from his seat for the first time in hours, apparently, one hand resting on the overhead compartment, his back to her. He was taller than she'd clocked from the seated position, taller and broader across the shoulders. And she had approximately 2 seconds to absorb this, before he turned and saw her, and then they were both simply standing there in the narrow aisle with precisely not enough room for 2 people. "Sorry," she said for the second time that flight. He stepped to the side to let her pass. So did she, the same direction. They stopped. A beat. He almost smiled. Moved the other way. She did the same. She felt idiotic. He made a small, quiet sound that might, in better lighting and a less embarrassing context, have been a laugh. She started. "Go ahead," he said at the same moment. He pressed back against the seats to let her through, and she moved past him in the narrow corridor. And that was when it happened. The aisle was not designed for 2 adults passing comfortably, and so for one brief, inescapable moment, she was close enough that her shoulder brushed his chest, close enough that she had to turn slightly sideways, close enough that his scent reached her the way it had in the boarding area. Except now it was warmer, more present, deepened by hours of travel into something that felt dangerously like intimacy. Sandalwood, cedar, the warmer human note beneath both of those. She breathed it in without meaning to, and felt it settle somewhere it had no business settling. She looked up. He was already looking at her. Not the polite, incidental glance of 2 strangers navigating a tight space, something stiller than that. His dark eyes held hers with the same unhurried directness he'd had all evening, only now they were close enough that she could see the detail in them, the quiet intelligence, the faint lines at the corners that suggested he was older than she'd first thought, and that he had spent considerable time paying attention to things. His jaw was inches from her eyeline. The line of it was almost unfairly clean. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt like something you'd remember. She made herself move, stepped past him into the clear aisle, put one foot in front of the other with what she hoped was composure, and walked back to her suite without looking back. She sat down. She pulled the blanket up to her chin. Her face was warm, properly warm, the kind that starts at the jaw and moves upward without asking permission. And her heart was doing something loud and unnecessary against her ribs, the kind of rhythm that had no interest in being told. This was nothing. This was a man in an aisle. This was proximity and low lighting, and 11 hours of suspended reality at 35,000 feet, making ordinary things feel significant. It was 3 seconds, she told herself. It was nothing. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about sandalwood and cedar and the exact quality of his gaze, and did not sleep again for a very long time. Heathrow arrivals at 6 in the morning had its own specific atmosphere. The arrivals hall fluorescent bright against the dark outside, the air carrying that indoor airport mix of recycled warmth and floor cleaner and dozens of different perfumes. Families held handwritten signs. Drivers stood in dark coats with tablets showing surnames. People emerged through the automatic doors, trailing luggage and jet lag, and the particular blankness of very long journeys. Zara retrieved her case from the carousel, found the exit, and stood for a moment in the grey January morning light of the car park pickup zone. She breathed. The damp London air smelled of diesel and rain and wet pavement and something she would have to call, without irony, home. She had her phone out, pulling up her transport app, when it lit up with a message instead. Unknown number, UK country code. The message read, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." She read it twice. She looked in the front pocket of her carry-on. The small exterior pocket she'd unzipped somewhere in the last hours of the flight, groping around for lip balm in the dark. There was a charging cable in it that was not hers. Matte black, flat-braided, coiled with the kind of deliberate neatness that suggests a person who does not tolerate disorder in small things. The kind of cable that came in packaging without its name printed on it, because the people who bought it already knew. She looked at the message. She looked at the cable. She typed, "How did you get this number?" His reply came fast, as though he'd been waiting. "You left your earphone case on your seat." She blinked. Then she remembered. The white sticker she'd put on her earphone case months ago, back when she'd been losing things left and right, and her friend had teased her into labelling everything. Her name and number in her own handwriting, slightly slanted, slightly rushed. She held the cable in her hand. The January cold was beginning to come through her coat. Around her, the pickup zone turned over its slow rotation of arriving cars and departing passengers, and the grey sky pressed low over the terminal roof. And London did what London does in January, which is nothing particularly welcoming. She typed, "When do you want it back?" His response, "Whenever is convenient." She looked at the cable. She thought about the way he'd existed beside her for 11 hours. Quiet, contained, unhurried, not cold, not shy, something else. Simply private in the way that some people are private, not as a wound or a wall, but as a settled fact about themselves. She typed, "Tomorrow, you choose where," and waited, standing in the cold, watching her phone. Before we dive deeper, if this story has you hooked, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love knowing where my romantics are. And if you haven't already, a like or subscription means the world and keeps this channel alive. He chose a coffee shop in Marylebone. It was the kind of place that felt tucked away from the world. A narrow room on a side street, steamed up windows, the smell of dark roast and something sweet baking somewhere in the back. Wooden tables worn soft at the edges. A single lamp on the counter throwing amber light across the whole room. Outside, London had decided it was a good day to rain, which meant the windows were blurred and the street beyond them looked like a watercolour that hadn't quite dried. Zara got there first. She ordered a flat white, took the small table at the back near the window, and watched rain run in thin lines down the glass. She told herself this would take 10 minutes. Cable handoff, polite goodbye, done. She had things to do. She was a person with things to do. She wrapped both hands around her cup and watched the door. He was exactly on time. He came in from the rain, a dark coat, a few drops on the shoulders. and found her immediately. No scanning the room, just a quiet, direct recognition, like he'd already accounted for where she'd be. He sat down. "Thank you for this," he said. "Of course." She slid the cable across the table. He looked at it for a moment before pocketing it, the way you look at something small that caused more trouble than it should have. She reached for her bag. "What are you drinking?" he said. She paused. "Flat white." "Is it good?" She looked at her cup, then back at him. "It's really good, actually." He stood up without another word, went to the counter, came back with a black coffee. No sugar. He settled into the chair across from her like someone who had decided, quietly, to stay for a while. "I'm Min-jun," he said. "Zara." She tilted her head. "You already know that." "I do." The corner of his mouth moved, barely. "I suppose you'd want this back too." He gently placed her earphone case on her side of the coffee table. "Thank you." Outside, a bus went past, and the rain on the window shifted in its light. She looked at him. "So, London for work?" "Yes." "What kind of work?" "Strategy." She waited. He didn't add anything. She had the distinct impression that talking to him was like reading a book where someone had removed every other sentence. The meaning was there, somewhere, but you had to work for it. "That's not really an answer," she said. That almost smile again. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." She laughed. He looked at her when she laughed, not startled, not performing warmth he didn't feel, just watching, like her laugh was something he was paying attention to for reasons he hadn't fully worked out yet. They stayed for an hour. Outside, the rain kept falling, softly, steadily, the way January rain in London does when it's made its mind up. Inside, the coffee shop was warm and close, and smelled of roasted things. And the hour passed, the way good hours do, without you quite noticing them go. She did most of the talking. She was self-aware enough to know this, and self-aware enough to know she wasn't filling silence out of nerves. She was talking because he listened in a way that made talking feel worthwhile. He asked questions that were quiet and specific, and actually about what she'd said, not just the next thing he'd been planning to say. She found herself telling him things she hadn't planned to, about Japan, about the temples and the sake and sitting in a garden in Kyoto doing nothing for 2 whole hours, which had felt strange at first, and then slowly, like the closest she'd come to peace in months. "It worked," he said. She considered. "Mostly." He nodded like he understood what mostly meant. "Why Japan?" he said. She turned her cup in her hands. The rain tapped the window beside them. "Relationship ended," she said. "Not badly, just finally. The kind of ending that makes sense and still feels wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "You know that feeling?" she said. "When it's not even a surprise, but it still knocks the air out of you a bit." A pause. Long enough that the cafe filled in around it, the hiss of the coffee machine, the low music she'd barely registered until now, the sound of rain. "Yes," he said quietly. "I know that feeling." The way he said it made her think he wasn't talking about a person. She didn't ask. She just let it sit there between them, warm and unexamined, the way certain things are better left. Eventually the coffees were gone and the hour was over, and the real world was still outside waiting. On the pavement they stood in the January rain. She had an umbrella, he didn't seem bothered, and did the pause that happens when 2 people aren't quite ready to go in opposite directions, but know they're about to. "Enjoy the rest of London," she said. "Thank you for the cable," he said. She walked to the tube. She was not thinking about him. She was thinking about dinner, and whether she had anything in, and how good that coffee had been, actually, and whether she'd go back just for that. And then she decided to Google him on the Underground. She told herself it was idle curiosity, the kind of thing anyone would do. She typed Kang Min-jun into the search bar the way you type something you expect to yield nothing interesting. Kang Min-jun. The results loaded. She read the first result, then the second. Then she went back to the first one because she thought she'd misread it. She hadn't. Kang Min-jun, 34, Executive Director of Kang Industries Group, one of South Korea's largest conglomerates, hospitality, real estate, logistics, technology, son of the chairman, Oxford educated, profiled in the Financial Times, Bloomberg, Forbes Korea, on the board of 3 international firms. Most recent headline, translated from a Korean business journal. Kang Industries, eyes major UK expansion. Chairman's son leading strategy. She sat with her phone in her lap as the tube moved through the dark. Strategy, he had said. Just that one word, offered like it was nothing, like it answered the question. And then he'd gone to the counter and come back with a black coffee and sat across from her in a small warm room while the rain fell outside and listened to her talk about Kyoto Gardens like he had all the time in the world. She pulled up the profile photo, a formal event, dark suit, looking directly into the camera, the same expression he'd worn across the table from her an hour ago, calm, considered, giving away absolutely nothing. She locked her phone. Of all the seats she could have had, she told herself she wasn't going to look him up again. She'd looked him up once on the tube home, which was reasonable, idle curiosity, anyone would have done it. And she'd put her phone away and gone home and made pasta and watched television and not thought about him mostly. That was fine. That was normal. She looked him up again at 11 o'clock that night, sitting cross-legged on her bed with her laptop open and the rain still going outside. Kang Industries Group, founded 1968, diversified across hospitality, logistics, real estate and technology, annual revenue in the upper tier of South Korean conglomerates. The London expansion was real, a major hotel acquisition in the process of completion, a logistics partnership being negotiated with a British firm, a flagship office opening in the city in the spring. She found a conference panel from 2 years ago, 22 minutes of footage, him at a table with 4 other people talking about sustainable investment strategy in the Asia-Pacific region. He spoke in measured paragraphs without notes, his English precise and unhurried. He didn't smile for the camera. He didn't perform authority. He simply had it, the way certain people do, as though it had always been there and he'd simply grown into it. She watched 6 minutes of it before she caught herself and closed the laptop. He's a man you met on a plane, she thought. You returned his cable. That's the end of it. She turned her light off. She lay in the dark, listening to the rain. She thought about sandalwood and cedar, about the quality of his attention across a small table, about the way he'd said "I know that feeling," quietly, almost to himself, like something he hadn't meant to offer. She fell asleep at midnight and dreamed about nothing in particular. She ran into him 4 days later, not planned, not even plausibly planned. She was in Marylebone again, purely because she'd had a meeting nearby and her coat wasn't warm enough for the long way back to the tube, and the wine shop on the high street had a January sale she'd been meaning to look at. She was standing at the end of an aisle, reading the back of a Burgundy. She probably couldn't justify when she heard footsteps stop beside her. She knew before she looked up. She looked up anyway. He was in a different coat today. Charcoal wool, longer, the collar turned up against the cold. He looked like he'd been walking, his cheeks carrying the faint high colour that comes from January air, and he was holding a bottle of something red and regarding her with the expression she was beginning to recognise as his version of surprised. Which was to say, he looked exactly the same as usual, but with a quality of stillness that was fractionally more deliberate. "You live nearby," he said. Not a question. Close enough. She looked at the bottle in his hand. "You know wine?" "Some." She looked at the Burgundy she was holding. He looked at it too. "That one's too young," he said. "Another 3 years and it would be worth what they're asking." She turned it over in her hands. What would you get instead? He moved along the shelf, unhurried, certain, and returned with a bottle that was half the price and had no elaborate label. He held it out. She took it. And in the small transfer of the bottle, her fingers met his briefly, just the tips, just for a second. The cold of the bottle, the warmth of his hand. She looked at the label. She was not thinking about the label. Trust me, he said. It came out lower than she thought he intended, like he'd aimed for casual and landed somewhere more serious. She looked up at him. He was very close. The aisle was narrow and neither of them had moved, and the distance between them was the kind that had to be chosen one way or the other, and neither of them was choosing. This close she could smell him again. Of course she could. Sandalwood and cedar and something warmer today. The cold air on his coat, the faint, clean smell of winter on skin, and underneath it all that same quiet, expensive, entirely unfair note that had reached her in the aircraft aisle and lodged itself somewhere in her memory like a song you couldn't unlearn. She breathed in carefully, through her nose, trying to make it look like nothing. Her heart was already doing what it had done in the aisle of the plane at 35,000 feet. That same unnecessary percussion behind her ribs that she had absolutely not given it permission for. I'll trust you, she said. The line of his mouth softened. It showed a degree of warmth, held just at the surface and not released. He nodded once. They went to the counter together, which happened naturally and without being decided. He paid for his bottle before she could reach her card. She looked at him. You paid for your own coffee last time, he said simply, as though that settled it. Outside, the cold hit them both. The street was bright grey and damp, puddles reflecting the shop fronts. She pulled her coat tighter. He seemed unbothered by the cold, the way he seemed unbothered by most things. Quietly, constitutionally, as if discomfort was something he'd simply agreed not to participate in. They stood on the pavement. Dinner, he said. She looked at him. Not a question, he said. Then, a beat later, as though he'd heard himself. Unless you'd prefer it to be. The corner of her mouth pulled. Where? There's a Japanese place on Blandford Street. 10 minutes. She thought about the pasta she'd been planning to make. She thought about the very sensible evening she'd had mapped out. All right, she said. The restaurant was small and warm, and lit the way Japanese restaurants do it best. Low and amber, each table its own quiet world. It smelled of dashi and grilled things and the particular umami warmth of miso, and stepping inside from the January cold felt like being received. They were given a table near the back. Candles. Close enough together that she was aware of him in the way she always seemed to be aware of him. Not intrusively, not obviously, just constantly. Like a sound you couldn't stop hearing once you'd noticed it. She took off her coat. He took off his. She watched him do it in her peripheral vision and told herself she wasn't watching. He was wearing a dark shirt. Simple. Fitted in the way of clothes that cost enough not to need to announce themselves. The cuffs were folded back, once, precisely, and she had an entirely unbidden recollection of his hands in the aircraft aisle, the way he'd reached down and freed her bag without ceremony, and she looked at the menu with great concentration. Do you want to order for both of us? She said. He looked at her over the menu. Yes. You don't need to ask what I like. I have some idea. She should have found that presumptuous. She did not find it presumptuous. He ordered in quiet, unhurried Japanese, not perfectly, she could tell, but confidently, the accent sitting slightly oddly but the effort genuine, and the server nodded and withdrew. And they were alone again in the amber light with the low sound of the restaurant around them, and the rain beginning again outside the window. She watched him. She was, she realised, doing the thing she'd promised herself she wouldn't do. Cataloguing him, detail by detail, like her eyes were making a case her brain hadn't agreed to hear yet. the clean line of his jaw, the way his brow sat low when he was thinking, giving him a look of permanent, slightly weary consideration that shouldn't have been attractive and was. The particular quality of his stillness, not the stillness of someone with nothing happening inside, she understood that now, but the stillness of someone with too much happening inside and a very practiced management of it. He was looking at the window, some private thought moving behind his eyes. She wondered what Kang Industries Group felt like from the inside, whether the weight of it sat on him the way inherited things sometimes did, not a gift so much as a set of walls someone else had built around your life. "What are you thinking?" she said. He looked back at her. A pause. The kind he seemed to use not because he needed time to find an answer, but because he was deciding how much of the answer to give. "I was thinking," he said, "that this is the third time we've been in the same room in a week, and that twice were accidental." "Only twice," she said. "I returned your cable on purpose." "Yes." Something in his expression. "You did." The food arrived. Small dishes, beautifully arranged, the kind of menu designed for sharing. Steam rose from the bowl between them, and the smell of it was extraordinary, layered and warm, and for a few minutes they were occupied with the practical business of eating. He ate the way he did everything, without rush, with complete attention. She ate a piece of yellowtail and closed her eyes without meaning to. "Good?" he said. She opened her eyes. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before, not the careful neutrality, not the almost smile. Something quieter, something that looked, in the candlelight, almost fond. "Extremely," she said. The dinner moved the way the coffee had moved, in that particular unhurried way that happens when neither person is watching the time. She talked, and he listened, and he talked, and she listened, and somewhere in the middle of it, the distance between them, that careful, sensible distance, grew harder to locate. She laughed at something he said, and it surprised him, she could tell, in a way that pleased her. He made a dry observation about the London property market that was so precisely delivered, she put her chopsticks down. "That was funny," she said. "I know," he said, which made her laugh again. He watched her laugh the way he had in the coffee shop, directly, quietly, with an attention that felt like being held by something she couldn't see. She reached for her water glass at the same time he reached for the small serving dish between them and their wrists crossed in the narrow space above the table. Not a collision. Something slower than that. A moment where two people arrive at the same point and neither immediately withdraws. She felt the warmth of his skin against hers. Felt him go still. She looked up. He was already looking at her. Close enough that she could hear the slight change in his breathing. A fractional deepening, barely perceptible, the kind of thing you only notice in a quiet room when you are paying more attention to someone than you meant to. Her own breath had done something similar without asking her. She could smell him again. Warm now, warmed by the restaurant in the evening, the sandalwood and cedar undercut with something that was simply him. The particular warmth of a person close enough to be real. It reached into her and did something she didn't have clean language for. Not want, exactly. Or not just that. More like recognition, like something in her that she hadn't consulted simply said, "Yes, this, here." Neither of them moved for a moment that was slightly too long for accident. Then she withdrew her hand, reached for her water, took a sip she didn't need. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said quietly. And they both looked at the table, and the candle between them threw its small warm light. And outside the rain kept falling on the London street, and she sat very still and felt her pulse in her fingertips, and said absolutely nothing about any of it. They walked out into the cold together. The rain had softened to something light and persistent, barely rain, just the idea of it, and the street was quiet and orange-lit and smelled of wet stone. He walked with her to the tube. They didn't decide to. It just happened the way things between them seemed to happen, without announcement. At the entrance she stopped, turned. He was a step behind her, hands in his coat pockets, looking at her with that same unhurried directness that she'd first seen in the aircraft at 35,000 feet and hadn't been able to fully account for since. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "Thank you for the wine recommendation," he said. She smiled. He looked at her smile the way he'd looked at her laugh, carefully, as if he were storing it somewhere. "Zara," he said, just her name, nothing attached to it. But the way he said it, low and deliberate, the two syllables given equal weight, like he'd been thinking about how it sounded, made her chest do something it had no business doing on a pavement in Marylebone in January. "Yes?" she said. A pause. The rain barely fell. "Nothing," he said. "Good night." She went down the steps. She did not look back, because she knew with complete certainty that if she looked back he would still be standing there, and she was not ready for what that would do to her. She sat on the tube going home and pressed her fingers together in her lap, the same wrist that had touched his, and stared at the dark window opposite, and thought about his breathing changing in a quiet restaurant, and the way her name had sounded in his voice, and told herself she had everything under control. She believed this less and less with every stop. 3 weeks passed. Zara did what she always did after something she wasn't ready to examine. She worked. She took on a project she'd been putting off, reorganised her client files, went to the gym 4 times in 1 week, and had dinner with Sophie on a Tuesday, which they never did on a Tuesday. "You're doing the thing," Sophie said over her pasta. "I'm not doing a thing." The productive thing, where you get very organised and very busy because something is happening in your head that you'd rather not look at. Zara refilled her wineglass. "I'm just on top of things." Sophie looked at her. "I met someone," Zara said. It's nothing. He's Korean. He lives in Seoul. I returned his charging cable and we had dinner and that was it." "You had dinner?" "At a Japanese place in Marylebone. It was fine." "Just fine." Zara thought about his breathing changing across a restaurant table, about the way her name had sounded in his voice on a wet pavement in January, about the 40 minutes she'd spent on the tube afterwards staring at her own reflection in the dark window and feeling like someone had reached into her chest and rearranged things without asking. "Completely fine," she said. Sophie said nothing, which was, as always, its own kind of answer. Her firm was called in on the project in early February. It was a big one. An interior design and consultancy brief for a major hotel acquisition in the city. The clients wanted a complete redesign of 4 floors before the spring launch. New concept, new aesthetic, every detail signed off before March. It was the kind of project that filled your whole screen and left no room for anything else, which was, frankly, ideal. The briefing was in a glass-walled meeting room on the 14th floor of a building that smelled of new carpet and ambition. There were 6 people on the client side. Her director gave her a nudge under the table when the documents were distributed, which meant this is the one, pay attention. She paid attention. She was reading the project overview, the acquisition details, the brand positioning, the timeline, when she turned the page and saw the company name at the top of the letterhead. Kang Industries Group. She read it twice. She looked at the page. She looked at the 6 people sitting across the table. He was not among them. Of course he wasn't. He was an executive director, not someone who sat in preliminary briefings. She knew this. She understood this completely. She turned back to the document and was extremely professional for the rest of the meeting. She was in the hotel 3 days later, walking the 2nd floor with her colleague Dan and a measuring tape, when the lift opened at the end of the corridor. Min-jun stepped out. He was in a suit today. Dark navy, the kind of cut that required no acknowledgement of itself. With 2 men behind him carrying site documents, and the look of people moving at his pace rather than their own. He was mid-conversation, his attention on something one of them was saying, his expression carrying that particular quality of focused attention she'd catalogued in the wine shop, at the restaurant, on the plane. He looked up. Stopped. The corridor was long and quiet, and their eyes met across it with the specific inevitability of two people who have thought about each other more than they'd planned to. Dan said something beside her. She didn't hear it. Min-jun said something to the men with him. They peeled off toward a side room. He walked toward her with the same unhurried economy she'd watched settle into an aircraft suite 6 weeks ago. Zara, he said. He said her name the same way he had on the Marylebone pavement. Both syllables, full weight, like he'd been carrying it around and was only now putting it down. Min-jun. She kept her voice even. I didn't know you were back in London. I arrived yesterday. A pause, that characteristic pause, the one where he was deciding how much to give. I didn't know you'd be on this project. Small world, she said. Smaller than expected, he said. And then, almost to himself, quieter. I find I don't mind. Dan cleared his throat. She introduced them. They shook hands with the polite efficiency of two people who understand they are not the main event. Min-jun's attention returned to her almost immediately, in the way that attention does when it has somewhere it would rather be. Dinner, he said, when you're finished here. It wasn't quite a question. It wasn't quite a statement. It existed somewhere between the two, in that register that was specifically his. Offering something while leaving the door open, which she was beginning to understand was the most she could expect from him, and also, somehow, more than enough. I'll be finished at 6, she said. He nodded once. I'll find you. He walked away. She watched him go for exactly as long as she'd allow herself, which was not long, and then she turned back to Dan and the measuring tape and was extremely professional for the rest of the afternoon. Who was that? Dan said. The client, she said. Dan looked at her. Right, he said, in a tone that meant he had eyes. Over the next 2 weeks she saw more of him than she'd expected, which was to say, she saw him constantly. The project demanded it. Walkthroughs, design reviews, materials sign-off, scheduling meetings that ran long and turned into working lunches. Min-jun was across all of it, not micromanaging, but present. Paying attention in that total way of his that made you sharper simply by proximity. She learned things. She learned that he was decisive in meetings in a way that left no room for ambiguity, but somehow didn't feel authoritarian. He'd listen completely, ask 1 or 2 questions that exposed the weak point in an argument without humiliating anyone, and then state his position with a quietness that made discussion feel not just possible but welcome. She watched 3 different people change their minds in his presence and leave the room feeling good about it. She learned that he took his coffee black, always, but would spend an unreasonable amount of time choosing between 2 nearly identical material samples, running his thumb along the edge of each one with a faint line of concentration between his brows that she'd started to look for. She learned that he was funny. This one surprised her most. It happened first in a materials meeting that had run 40 minutes over time, during which a vendor had presented 12 variations of the same shade of grey with mounting enthusiasm. Zara had been writing grey. 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 Greyer. In her notebook, at diminishing levels of investment, when she noticed Min-jun, beside her, had written a single word in the margin of his document and underlined it twice. Grey. She pressed her lips together. He glanced sideways without turning his head. The line between his brows deepened, which she'd begun to recognise as suppressed amusement. She looked back at the presentation. After the meeting, walking down the corridor to the lift, he said, 17 minutes on the 4th sample. He really believed in it, she said. He named it, Min-jun said. She stopped. I'm sorry. Slide 9. He named it. Quiet Cloud. She looked at him. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth threatened movement, that carefully managed neutrality slightly undermined by someone who found the world funnier than they generally let on. She laughed. Properly, helplessly, the kind that came from somewhere she hadn't expected. He watched her laugh the way he always watched it, directly and quietly, and with something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one, close enough that she felt it. "Quiet, Cloud," she said when she'd recovered. "Quiet, Cloud," he confirmed gravely, and they got in the lift, and she was still smiling when the doors closed, and she was aware of him beside her in the small, warm space. His arm almost touching hers, his scent warm and familiar now, in the way that certain things become familiar before you've given them permission. Sandalwood, cedar, the clean winter note that clung to his coat. And underneath all of it, that quieter warmth that was simply him, present and close and entirely devastatingly difficult to ignore. She looked at the numbers above the door. He looked at the numbers above the door. Neither of them said anything. The doors opened. They walked out into the lobby and the cold came in from the street and she breathed it like a correction. By the end of the second week, she'd stopped being surprised by them and started waiting for them instead. The dry observation delivered without preamble, the single word underlined in a meeting. The way he'd look at her sideways when something amused him, checking whether she'd caught it too, which she always had. It felt, she thought, uncomfortably like being known. She didn't examine that too closely. They worked late on a Thursday. Most of the team had gone by 7. The hotel floor they were using as a temporary project base was quiet by 8. Just the two of them, her laptop and his, the plans spread across the long table between them, 2 takeaway containers of something Thai growing cold at the edges. She'd taken her shoes off at some point. He'd rolled his sleeves up. These things had happened without comment because by this point they had passed the threshold of formality and landed in something more honest and more dangerous. He was working through a spreadsheet. She was annotating floor plans. The silence between them was the good kind, full rather than empty, the kind that only settles between people who have stopped needing to perform. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, London did what London does at night. Threw its amber light up at a sky that never quite went dark, the distant sound of the city a low and constant hum. She looked up at some point and just watched him. He was frowning slightly at the screen, one hand raised to his jaw, a gesture she'd catalogued weeks ago and had not managed to stop noticing. His collar was open at the top. The lamplight caught the angle of his cheekbone and the dark sweep of his lashes, and she sat across the table from him and thought, with a clarity that was almost inconvenient. He is one of the most beautiful people I have ever been in a room with. Not beautiful in the soft sense, in the structural sense, the kind that didn't require good lighting or good angles because it was simply true in any light, at any angle, working late on a Thursday with cold Thai food and his sleeves rolled up. She looked back at her floor plans. Then he went still. The particular quality of his stillness shifted. It went from focused to something else. Something tighter. She'd learned to read the gradations of his stillness by now, without meaning to, the way you learn to read weather. She looked up. He was staring at his laptop screen. His face had done something she had never seen it do. The colour had left it. Not gradually, but completely. The way colour leaves something when the light is suddenly taken away. His jaw was set. His eyes were fixed on the screen with an expression she couldn't name because she'd never seen him without his composure before. And this was what was underneath it. Something stripped and very still, like an open country with no shelter. He read whatever was on the screen once, then again. Then he closed the laptop. Closed it with a quietness that was somehow worse than if he'd slammed it. The deliberate, careful quietness of someone managing something very large in a very small space. He sat for a moment with his hand flat on the lid. She didn't speak. She waited, the way you wait when someone is standing at the edge of something, and you don't yet know whether they need a hand or simply a witness. He looked up. For one unguarded second, he looked at her across the table with everything showing. Something heavy and complicated and older than anything she'd seen in him before. something that had been waiting behind the composure all along. Then the composure came back. She watched it settle like a door being quietly, carefully closed. "It's late," he said. His voice was even, perfectly even, as though the last 30 seconds hadn't happened. "Min-jun?" "I'll walk you out," he said. He stood, put on his coat, held the door for her. And whatever had been on that screen, whatever had turned his face white and his eyes to something she didn't have a word for yet, he carried it alone, down the corridor and into the lift and out onto the cold London street. She walked to the tube. She thought about his face, about the hand flat on the lid of the laptop, about the way he'd looked at her for that one unguarded second like she was the only solid thing in the room. She thought, something is wrong. She thought, he won't tell me. She thought, I want him to. And that, she understood, stepping onto the tube platform with the warm rush of air from the tunnel was a problem. Because wanting Min-jun to tell her things was not the same as wanting to return a cable or share a meal or stand in a wine shop on a cold afternoon. Wanting him to tell her things was something else entirely. Something that lived closer to the centre of her, in the part she'd been carefully, sensibly guarding for months. She sat down. The doors closed. The train moved. She stared at her own hands in her lap and did not tell herself it was nothing, because she was tired, finally, of not believing herself. He didn't mention the email the next day. Zara hadn't expected him to. She was learning the architecture of him by now. The way he compartmentalised with the precision of someone who had been doing it for so long it had become structural, load-bearing, the thing that held everything else up. You didn't ask Min-jun about the closed doors. You waited to see which ones he chose to open. She waited. He arrived at the hotel at 9, composed and punctual, in a coat that smelled of cold air and that particular sandalwood warmth she'd stopped pretending she didn't notice. He said good morning. He reviewed the materials schedule. He asked one precise question about the lighting plan for the 3rd floor that exposed a problem nobody else had spotted. Completely normal, completely contained. She watched him across the table and thought about the colour leaving his face, and said nothing. It was a Friday when it cracked. Not dramatically. Not the way things crack in films. No raised voices, no door left open in the rain. It cracked the way ice cracks at the end of winter. Slowly, beneath the surface, along lines that had been forming for longer than anyone had noticed. They'd finished early for once. The rest of the team had gone. She was pulling on her coat when he said, without preamble, without looking up from the plans he was rolling, "Do you want to walk?" She looked at him. Outside the window, London had produced one of its rare February evenings. Cold, yes, but clear. The sky over the city holding on to the last pale blue of late afternoon before the dark came in. "Yes," she said. They walked along the embankment. The Thames was dark and wide beside them, carrying its usual cargo of reflected light. The bridges, the buildings on the south bank, the whole amber sprawl of the city laid out in the water in long wavering lines. The air smelled of the river, something mineral and cold and ancient underneath the more contemporary notes of the city. Their breath made small clouds that disappeared almost immediately. She didn't ask him anything. She'd learned that silence was a language he was fluent in, and that the best way to hear him was often to stop filling the space. They walked for several minutes before he spoke. "My grandfather built the company in 1968, he said. From nothing. Logistics at first, trucks mostly. He worked 18-hour days for 20 years. She listened. "My father joined at 22. He was meant to be a doctor. He had a place at Yonsei, medicine. He gave it up." A pause. "He didn't choose to. He told me that once. Only once. He said it like it was a fact about the weather, not his life." The river moved beside them. A boat went past, low and slow, its wake spreading across the dark water in long silver chevrons. "And you?" she said quietly. He looked straight ahead. "I was sent to Oxford at 18. Law. My grandfather chose it." Another pause. "He died in my second year. My father called me home for the funeral. When I came back, I was studying economics. Nobody discussed the change." She absorbed this. The city went on around them, a bus on the bridge, voices somewhere behind them, the distant sound of a siren fading out. "You didn't want economics," she said. "I didn't want law either," he said. "It wasn't the subject. It was the understanding that the subject didn't matter. The path was the path. The subject was just the surface of it." He stopped at the railing above the water, put both hands on it, looking out. His profile in this light, the bridge behind him, the sky above the south bank, was very clean and very still. She stopped beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of him against the cold air, that sandalwood and cedar reaching her the way it always did, steady and present and somehow quieting. "What would you have studied?" she said. A long pause. The water moved below them. "Architecture," he said. "I wanted to build things, structures, the way a building can hold people, the way you can design for light or sound or movement, the way a room can make you feel something before you've understood why." He paused. "I've never said that to anyone." She looked at him. The admission sat between them in the cold air, slightly raw, the way things are when they've been kept inside for a long time and finally meet the weather. "It makes sense," she said. "The way you look at materials, the way you notice things in the hotel that other people don't." He turned his head, looked at her. "You noticed that," he said. "I notice things too," she said. He looked away toward the river. When he looked back, some of the distance had gone. He turned back to the river. "My life was planned in rooms I wasn't in," he said. "School, career, the company structure, my role within it." He said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse than bitterness would have been. Bitterness would have been a response. This was something older, a fact so long accepted it had lost its edges. Even relationships. The word landed quietly between them. She kept her gaze on the water. "What does that mean?" Another pause, the longest one yet. "My family has expectations," he said carefully, "about who would be appropriate." "Appropriate," she repeated. "A word my father uses," he said. "He uses it the way some people use right or correct, as though the two things are the same." She thought about the woman she was. British, mixed, her mother Jamaican, her father English, a freelance interior designer with a flat in North London and a ceramic bowl from Kyoto and a tendency to fall asleep on planes. She thought about what appropriate might mean in rooms she also wasn't in. She didn't ask, but she felt the weight of it settle, and she suspected he could tell. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the shape of his life, for the rooms, for the architecture degree he'd never taken." He glanced at her. "Don't be. I've had a very comfortable life." "That wasn't what I was apologising for." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "I know." They found a pub a little further along the embankment, the kind that had been there long enough to smell of it, dark wood and old upholstery, and the particular warmth of a room that has held 1,000 winter evenings before this one. She ordered wine. He ordered whiskey, which surprised her and then didn't. They sat in the corner, the noise of the Friday crowd around them, close enough to feel anonymous, far enough from anyone to speak. He was different here than he was in meetings. She'd been watching it happen gradually for 2 weeks, the careful professional exterior softening by degrees, like a city emerging from fog. First the outlines, then the details, then the colour. Here in a pub on a Friday with a whiskey in his hand, and London outside the window, the last of the day's composure had come down quietly, like a coat he'd finally taken off. She could see him more clearly than she'd seen him before. He was tired, not the surface tiredness of a long day, something deeper, more structural, the kind that lives in the eyes and doesn't shift with sleep. "Tell me something true," she said. He looked at her over his glass. "What does that mean?" "It means not the official version, not what you'd say in a meeting or in an interview or to your father." She held his gaze. "Something actually true." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Around them the pub moved and breathed, laughter from somewhere, the clink of glasses, the low Friday warmth of people releasing the week. "I haven't been happy," he said finally. "Not for a long time. I've been effective, I've been focused, I've managed things well, but I haven't been—" He stopped. "Happy," she said. "Happy," he confirmed. As though the word was slightly unfamiliar in his mouth, like a phrase from a language he'd studied but rarely used. She sat with that. The candle on the table between them threw its small, warm light across his face, catching the line of his jaw, the shadow beneath his cheekbone, the dark eyes that were watching her with that openness she'd seen flicker in and out all evening, slightly more open now, the whiskey and the hour and the telling having moved something that the daytime hadn't. "When were you last happy?" she said. He thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, not performing consideration but actually searching. "Tokyo," he said. 2 years ago. I had 3 days between meetings, an error in the scheduling. I wasn't supposed to have them. I didn't tell anyone." A brief smile appeared and disappeared before it fully formed. "I walked around the city for 3 days with no agenda. I went to a museum, I ate at counters. I slept past 6 for the first time in years." He paused. "I didn't answer calls." She thought about her own 10 days in Japan, the temples and the ramen and the Kyoto garden. 2 people who'd found the same place at the edges of their own lives, trying to remember what they felt like. "Me too," she said. "Japan." He looked at her. "Not Tokyo," she said. "Kyoto? But yes." Something passed between them in the candlelight, a recognition, warm and wordless, the kind that doesn't require explanation because explanation would only diminish it. His hand was on the table between them, not reaching for anything, simply resting there, close enough to hers that she was aware of the distance the way you're aware of something just at the edge of your peripheral vision. She didn't move her hand. He didn't move his. It was past 10 when they finally left, stepping out from the warmth of the pub into a night that had gone properly cold, the kind of cold that finds the gap between your collar and your scarf and makes itself at home. The embankment was quiet now, the river dark and wide beside them, the city's reflection blurred in the water. He walked her to the tube the way he had before, not decided, just happening, the way their evenings seemed to find their own shape without being planned. At the entrance she stopped, turned. He was looking at her. The tiredness she'd seen earlier was still there, but something alongside it that was different, something slightly less careful, slightly more present, as though the evening had moved him closer to the surface of himself than he normally permitted. She thought about what he'd told her, the architecture degree, the planned life, the 3 stolen days in Tokyo where he hadn't answered calls, the word happy sitting in his mouth like something foreign. She wanted to reach up and touch his face. She kept her hands in her pockets. "Min-jun," she said. "Whatever was in that email on Thursday?" He went still. "You don't have to tell me," she said. "But I want you to know. You can." He looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight he seemed to be weighing several futures at once, and she could see the thing behind his eyes that was always there, contained, carefully managed, carried alone. He opened his mouth. Then his phone rang. He looked at it, his jaw set before he turned away, the kind of thing you miss if you're not paying attention. I have to take this, he said. I know, she said. She went down the steps. She was 3 down when she heard him say something in Korean, his voice dropping, losing the considered English quality entirely, and becoming something else, faster, tighter, a language that belonged to a version of him she hadn't met yet. She didn't look back. She sat on the tube and pressed her hands between her knees, and thought about a man who'd wanted to build things, who'd spent his life in rooms where the decisions were made before he arrived. She thought about his hand on the table, close enough to reach. She thought about his face when he'd said, "I haven't been happy." Not sad about it, which would have been easier, but matter of fact, which was so much worse. She was 3 stops from home when her phone lit up. A message. Min-jun. I don't think I'm going back to Seoul. She stared at it, read it again. The train moved through the dark. The words sat on the screen, small and precise and enormous, the way certain sentences are. The ones that sound like one thing and mean several others, all of them significant, all of them pointing toward a future that hasn't been decided yet. She typed, "What do you mean?" She watched the 3 dots appear, disappear, appear again. Then nothing. The train pulled into her station. She got off. She stood on the platform for a moment, phone in hand, the warm underground air moving around her. The message never came. She walked home through the cold, and let herself into her flat, and sat on the edge of her bed in her coat, and read his 4 words again in the dark. I don't think I'm going back to Seoul. She thought about what it cost a man like him to send something like that. A man who chose every word with the care of someone who understood that words, once released, couldn't be recalled. A man who had kept the shape of his life contained and managed and private for so long that saying something true, even in 4 words, even in a text, even at 10:30 on a Friday from a distance, was its own kind of extraordinary. She put her phone face down on the bed. She sat in the quiet of her flat, the night sounds of London coming in through the walls, distant traffic, somewhere a door, the ordinary soft percussion of a city going to sleep. She thought, something is shifting. She thought something has already shifted. And she thought, finally, sitting in her coat in the dark, I am not ready for what happens next, and I am going to walk toward it anyway. The text sat unanswered between them all weekend. Not because she hadn't tried. She'd typed 4 different responses on Friday night and deleted all of them. Too eager, too casual, too much, not enough. She'd put her phone face down on the kitchen counter on Saturday morning and made coffee and stood at her window watching the street below and told herself she was giving him space, which was true, and that she wasn't waiting for her phone to light up, which was not. Sunday came and went, grey and quiet. She cleaned her flat with the focused energy of a woman who was not thinking about a text message. Monday morning, 7:45. Her phone lit up. Min-jun. Good morning. Walk through at 9. Nothing else. No reference to Friday. No ellipsis trailing into explanation. Just the clean, forward-facing efficiency of someone who had decided, in whatever private process he conducted in the hours between, that the text had been sent and couldn't be unsent and would be left to mean what it meant without annotation. She stared at it. She typed, "See you at 9. She put her phone down. Picked it up again. She typed, "Good morning." She sent that one too. He was already there when she arrived. Dark coat, coffee in hand, black, always black, standing at the window of the 2nd floor looking out at the street below with the quality of stillness she'd mapped so carefully by now. The morning light came in at a low February angle, catching the line of his jaw and the sharp edge of his cheekbone, and doing exactly what morning light had no business doing to someone she was trying to be sensible about. He turned when he heard her. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. They looked at each other for exactly a moment longer than was professionally necessary. Then Dan arrived with a tube of plans under his arm, and the walkthrough began. and the moment folded itself away like a note pressed between pages. She began to notice the cracks that week. Not in his work. His work was as precise and focused as ever, his attention moving across every detail of the project with the same unhurried thoroughness that made everyone around him sharper. The cracks were elsewhere. In the smaller things. The things you only saw if you were watching. Which she was, with a careful attention she'd stopped pretending was professional. The first was the phone calls. He took them often enough that it hadn't seemed unusual in the first weeks. The project was large, the decisions many, the stakeholders spread across 3 time zones. A man in his position was always available to someone. But she began to notice the quality of them changing. The way he'd excuse himself from a room, not quickly but immediately, without the small social grace of finishing a sentence first. The way his expression, in the second before he turned away, would do that thing she'd seen on Thursday evening. The brief, telling tightening, the composure reassembling itself around something that needed containing. Twice she caught the tail end of Korean through a half-closed door. Not the measured pace of a business call, something faster. Shorter sentences, longer silences on his end, the particular flatness in a voice that is managing its own register very deliberately. She didn't ask, she noted. The second crack was the disappearances. He'd be there in the morning, fully present, engaged, asking questions, that dry, quiet humour surfacing in the margins of meetings like a current running just below a calm surface. And then after lunch he'd be gone. Not formally. No, I have a call at 3 or I'll be back by 4. Just gone, the way weather changes, and back an hour or 2 later with his coat still on, and the high colour of cold air in his face. His focus snapping back to the project without explanation or apology. She'd worked alongside enough people to know that everyone had their version of a closed door, but Min-jun's were multiplying. The third thing she noticed was subtler than both. He'd stopped mentioning Seoul. In the first weeks, Seoul had appeared naturally in conversation the way home cities do. A restaurant compared to one he knew there, a building that reminded him of a neighbourhood, the small casual geography of a life lived somewhere else. But sometime in the last 10 days, the references had stopped, cleanly, as though someone had quietly removed them. As though Seoul were a room he'd decided not to walk through any more, or couldn't, or wasn't sure existed in the form he'd left it. She thought about his text. I don't think I'm going back to Seoul. She thought about the email that had turned his face white. She thought, these things are connected. She thought, he's not going to tell me. The project gave them Thursday afternoon in a fabric showroom in Clerkenwell. Just the 2 of them, a long appointment that the rest of the team had sent them to on the logic that Min-jun's taste was precise and Zara's translation of it was now good enough to make the final selections without committee. The showroom was beautiful in the way of places built around beautiful things. High ceilings, long tables, the fabrics arranged in runs of colour and texture that moved from ivory to charcoal with the unhurried logic of a landscape. It smelled of something clean and slightly raw, thread and dye and old wood. The light was northern and even and kind to everything it touched. He was different here. She'd noticed it before. The way certain environments unlocked something in him that meetings and hotel corridors didn't. A space designed with care seemed to reach some part of him that the professional world couldn't quite access. He moved through the showroom slowly, which he never did anywhere else. He touched things, the edge of a woven textile, the weight of a velvet sample, running his thumb along the grain of a finish the way she'd seen him do with materials on site. This one, he said, holding up a length of dark linen. He held it to the light and it fell in clean, soft folds, the colour of deep water. For the reading room. She looked at it. He was right. He was always right about materials. Yes, she said. He laid it down, moved along the table. She watched him. She'd given up, mostly, on pretending she didn't find him beautiful. It was exhausting and also pointless. The evidence was too consistent and too close. Today, in the clear northern light of the showroom, in a coat he'd left open over a dark jumper, with his attention given entirely to the fabrics in front of him, and nothing of the professional armour needed, he was simply and straightforwardly the most compelling person she'd ever stood beside. The clean angles of his face, the careful deliberateness of his hands, the way his brow drew down in concentration with that faint line between it that she'd catalogued in spreadsheet meetings and lift doors, and once, memorably, while he was reading a dessert menu. She looked at a fabric she wasn't seeing. "Zara," he said. She looked up. He was holding 2 samples side by side, close in colour, different in texture. The question was on his face, not in words. She crossed to him, stood beside him at the table, close enough that his warmth reached her in the cool air of the showroom, that sandalwood and cedar, and the warmer human note beneath it moving through her the way it always did, quiet and certain and lodging itself somewhere she couldn't evict it from. She looked at the 2 samples. She reached out and touched the left one. The texture was subtler, more considered, the kind of choice that didn't announce itself. "This one," she said. He looked at her hand on the fabric, then at her. "Yes," he said, quietly. They were very close. The showroom was silent around them, just the distant sound of the street and the slight movement of fabric in the air from a vent somewhere above. She was aware of his breathing, that slight, deliberate evenness she'd heard change once in a restaurant over a crossed wrist and candlelight. She was aware of her own. She should step back. She looked up at him instead. He was looking at her with the same focus he usually reserved for decisions. Just this, open and direct and undisguised, the full weight of his attention with nothing deflecting it. It made her feel simultaneously seen and unsteady, the way you feel at the edge of something high when the view is extraordinary and the drop is real. His phone rang. The sound was a physical thing in the silence. She felt him change, felt it before she saw it, the subtle shift in the air around him, the composure returning like a tide. He looked at the screen. His expression altered. A shadow crossed it. The composure slipped for a second. Whatever he saw registered immediately. "I have to take this," he said. "I know," she said. He walked to the far end of the showroom, his back to her, his voice dropping immediately into Korean, quick and low and entirely different from the voice she knew, the voice that chose its English words with such care. She watched his shoulders, watched the set of them change as the call went on. The conversation was short, 4 minutes, perhaps 5, and when it ended he stood for a moment with his phone in his hand, not moving, staring past the showroom wall entirely. She waited. He came back, picked up the fabric samples. His face was composed, perfectly, carefully, completely composed. "Should we look at the curtain weights?" he said. She looked at him. "Min-jun." "The appointment ends at 5, he said. "We still have the bedroom floor to cover." She held his gaze. He held hers. The space between them was full of the things he wasn't saying, which she could feel the shape of without being able to name them. Large and complicated, and pressing against the composure from the inside. "All right," she said, finally. She looked at curtain weights. He stood beside her and described what he needed. She wrote it down. They were professional and thorough, and she didn't push. But when they left the showroom and walked out into the cold Clerkenwell afternoon, she noticed that he didn't suggest dinner. For the first time in 2 weeks, he didn't suggest dinner. He said goodnight at the corner, brief, warm enough, nothing wrong with it on the surface, and turned and walked in the opposite direction, with his phone already in his hand and his coat pulled close, and the particular quality of someone carrying a weight they've decided again to carry alone. She stood on the corner and watched him go. She thought about all the closed doors, the calls taken immediately, the disappearances, the silence where Seoul used to be. She thought, whatever is coming, it's close now. She thought, he knows it too. She was at her desk the following Tuesday, working from home, when her phone rang. Unknown number, international. She answered out of habit. Hello. A woman's voice. Korean accent, precise English, the tone of someone entirely accustomed to being taken seriously. I'm looking for Kang Min-jun. I was given this number as a project contact. Zara sat up slowly. He's not available at this number, she said carefully. Can I ask who's calling? A pause, brief but weighted. My name is Seo Yeon, the woman said. He'll know who I am. Please tell him I'm in London. Another pause, smaller, more deliberate. Tell him I came myself. He'll understand what that means. The line went quiet. Zara held the phone in her hand for a long moment after the call ended. Seo Yeon, in London. He'll know who I am. She said it to herself, quietly, in her empty flat. The certainty in that voice, the kind that didn't come from professional familiarity, the kind that came from something older than that, something closer. She put the phone down. She looked at her wall, at the project plans pinned there, the swatches and schedules, and the controlled, manageable shape of a project she understood completely. She thought about Min-jun's face in the showroom, the look she'd caught before the composure returned. She thought, he knew this was coming. She thought, he didn't tell me. And somewhere beneath the reasonable, sensible part of her, the part that knew she was not owed explanations, that this was not her life to know, something small and honest said, that's the part that hurts. She didn't pass on the message. She told herself it wasn't her place, that she was a designer on a project, not a personal assistant, not a gatekeeper, not anything that entitled her to insert herself into a phone call that was clearly nothing to do with floor plans or fabric samples. She told herself this cleanly and efficiently, and then spent the rest of Tuesday not working, staring at the project plans on her wall without seeing them. Wednesday morning she messaged him. Zara. A woman called Seo Yeon rang the project line yesterday. She said she's in London. She said you'd know what it means. She put the phone down. She picked it up 40 seconds later. The message had been read. The 3 dots appeared immediately, which was unusual for him. Min-jun was not a man who replied immediately, not out of rudeness, but out of the same consideration he applied to everything. He chose his responses the way he chose materials, carefully, with full attention. The dots disappeared. No reply came. She put the phone face down on her desk and opened her laptop and worked with the focused determination of a woman who was not watching her phone for 25 minutes. Then her door buzzer went. She crossed to the intercom. Yes? A pause. It's Min-jun. She stood with her hand on the intercom for a moment. Outside her window the February morning was pale and still, the street below quiet, a single car moving through the frame of it and then gone. She pressed the button. He looked different. She registered it the moment she opened the door. Something in the set of him, the way he was standing in the hallway of her building with his coat on and his hands in his pockets, and the particular quality of a man who has made a decision and is living in the seconds just after it. The composure was there, as always, but wearing thin in places, like a fabric that had been handled too much. He looked tired, not the structural tiredness she'd seen across a pub table on the embankment, something more immediate than that, the kind that came from a night of not sleeping. Come in, she said. He came in. She took his coat. He sat at her kitchen table, the small round one by the window, and she made coffee because it was something to do with her hands, and because the ritual of it filled the silence while whatever he'd come to say found its way to the surface. She put the coffee in front of him. Black, no sugar. She sat across from him with her own. He looked at the cup, then at his hands around it, then at her. "Seo Yeon," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window a pigeon landed on the ledge and then thought better of it, and left. "She works for my father," he said. "She has worked for him for 12 years. She handles—" He paused, choosing the things he prefers not to handle directly. Zara held her coffee cup and waited. "My father is unwell," he said. The words came out level, each one placed with care, the way you carry something fragile across a difficult floor. "He has been unwell for 8 months. The company doesn't know. The board doesn't know." A pause. "I've known since October." She absorbed this. The timeline settled into place. October he'd known since October, and then the London expansion, the strategy role, the long flights and longer hours. "The email," she said quietly. "Thursday evening." He looked at her. "His condition has progressed, faster than the doctors expected." He stopped. "Seo Yeon came because my father sent her, because he's asking me to come back and take over formally, not eventually. Now." The kitchen was very quiet. She thought about the man across the pub table who had said, "I haven't been happy," with the flatness of someone reporting a fact about a country he'd left long ago. She thought about the architecture degree, the 3 days in Tokyo, the careful management of a life that had been designed by other hands. "What did you tell her?" she said. "I haven't seen her yet." He looked at his coffee. "I came here first." Something moved through her at that, warm and complicated and too large for the space between her ribs where it was trying to fit. She pressed it down. "Why?" she said. He looked up. His eyes in the morning light were very dark and very direct, and holding something she'd seen in glimpses before, but never this close, never this unguarded. "Because," he said, and then stopped. He tried again. "Because I needed to sit somewhere that felt—" A pause, the longest one yet. "Real," he said finally, "before I go and sit somewhere that doesn't." She held his gaze. She did not look away, and neither did he, and the morning light came in through her kitchen window and lay quietly across the table between them, and she thought, "This is the most honest I have ever seen him, and also, this is the most honest I have ever let myself be with someone without using words." "Tell me about the company," she said. "Tell me what taking over means." So he did. He talked for a long time. She refilled the coffee without asking. He didn't stop talking. And she understood, listening, that he hadn't said most of this out loud before. That it had existed inside him as a weight that had no shape yet, and the act of speaking it was the act of giving it one. And it was painful the way that process is painful, like setting a bone. Kang Industries was not simply a company. It was a dynasty in the way that certain Korean conglomerates were dynasties. The family name inseparable from the institution inseparable from the identity of every person born into it. Hundreds of thousands of employees across 4 continents, 40 years of decisions compounding on each other. A board that had watched Min-jun grow up and had very specific ideas about what he was for. His father's illness was a crisis not just for the family, but for the architecture of an entire corporate structure. The succession needed to be managed carefully, announced precisely, handled in a way that reassured markets and satisfied stakeholders, and maintained the confidence of every person whose livelihood moved in the orbit of Kang Industries Group. All of which required Min-jun, in Seoul, immediately. "And the London project?" she said. A brief something crossed his face. "Someone else will take it over." He said it without expression, but she knew him well enough now to hear what was underneath. The small, clean grief of it. This hotel. These rooms he'd been designing in his mind since the first walkthrough, touching materials with the hands of a man who'd always known, in some private part of himself, that he was built for this. "Min-jun," she said. "It's fine," he said. The way people say things that are not fine, quickly, to prevent the conversation from landing on them. "It's not fine," she said. "You don't have to say that to me." He looked at her. She held his gaze. "You came here because it feels real, so let it." Something in his face shifted. The last of the composure, the deep structural layer of it that he wore even in his most open moments, moved, just slightly, just enough. "I've been trying to find a way out," he said quietly. "For 3 years, not away from the company entirely. I understand what it is. I understand what leaving would cost too many people. But a different version, a version where I had some part of the shape of my own life." He paused. London was supposed to be part of that, being here, running this expansion, being far enough away to breathe. She thought about his text. "I don't think I'm going back to Seoul." "And now," she said, "and now my father is ill and the company needs me and the version I was trying to build here." He stopped, pressed his thumb against the edge of his coffee cup. "It's not the version that's being asked for." The room was quiet. Outside, the street had come slightly to life. Footsteps, a distant van, the small, ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning in North London going about its business. "What do you want?" she said. He looked at her. "Not what's being asked of you," she said. "Not what your father wants or the board wants, or what Seo-yeon came all this way to collect. What do you want, Min-jun?" The question sat between them. She watched him receive it, watched the small difficulty of it, the way a man who had spent his entire life operating in the vocabulary of obligation rather than desire had to search for the answer in a part of himself that hadn't been consulted in years. He looked at her for a long, still moment. He looked at the table, at the window, at the ordinary Tuesday street outside. Then he looked back at her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she'd ever seen from him. Open in a way that had cost him something, and knew it had, and had decided that was all right. "I think you know," he said quietly. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, the ripple of them moving through her before she decided how to receive them. She held very still. Her heart was doing what it always did around him. But louder now, more insistent, pressing against its own containment like something that had finally run out of patience. She opened her mouth. His phone rang. She watched his face. Watched the stone drop into still water on his side too. The ripple, then the closing over it, the surface reassembling, the composure returning from wherever it went when he wasn't managing it. He looked at the screen. "Seo-yeon," he said. The name sat in the kitchen air between them like a third person. He looked at Zara. She looked at him. "You should go," she said. It cost her something to say it cleanly. She said it cleanly anyway. He didn't move immediately. He stayed exactly where he was, at her kitchen table in the morning light, looking at her with the expression she'd never have a clean word for, something that lived between intention and restraint, between everything and not yet. Then he stood. She brought his coat. He put it on, and she was close enough again to smell the sandalwood and the cedar and the warmth of him, close enough that if either of them had moved by a degree it would have changed the coordinates of everything. Neither of them moved. "Zara," he said. "Yes," she said. "When I've seen Seo-yeon." He held her gaze. "Can I come back?" She looked at him, at the tiredness in his face and the honesty in it, and the whole complicated architecture of him. The man who had wanted to build things, who had been building something in secret in the small spaces of his own life, who had walked into a wine shop on a January afternoon and handed her a bottle and said, "Trust me," in a voice that had landed somewhere she hadn't intended. "Yes," she said, "you can come back." He nodded once and left. She stood in her kitchen and listened to his footsteps in the corridor, the lift arriving, the small mechanical sigh of the doors closing. She stood there for quite a long time after the sound had gone. Then she sat back down at her kitchen table and put both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the space where he'd been sitting. "I think you know," he'd said. She did know, that was the thing. She had known for some time. In the part of herself she'd been carefully not consulting, the part she'd packed away after Andrew, after the accumulated weariness of every gentle unravelling, after the morning she'd looked at a grid of hopeful strangers and felt nothing except tired. She had known since a wine shop in Marylebone, since a Japanese restaurant, since the embankment at night and a pub full of Friday warmth, and a man who had said happy like a word in a foreign language he was trying to relearn. She sat at the table and let herself know it, fully without management. It felt terrifying. It felt in the same breath like the truest thing she'd felt in years. He came back at 8 that evening. She heard the buzzer and pressed the intercom without asking who it was. She already knew. He came through the door and she took one look at his face and said nothing, just stepped back to let him in. He sat at the kitchen table again, the same chair, as though it had already become his. And she poured whiskey this time because it was that kind of evening and sat across from him. He looked at the glass. "She brought documents," he said. "Formal succession papers, board approved, my father's request." He paused. "He's prepared everything, the announcement, the timeline, the transition structure. All I have to do is sign and come home." The word home sat strangely in the sentence. She noticed he'd used it without apparent awareness. "And the London project?" she said. "Handed over." He said it without expression. "Effective immediately." She absorbed the weight of that. "Min-jun, I'm sorry." He looked at the table. "It's more than the project," he said. He said it slowly, like each word was being chosen from a diminishing supply. I had started to believe that a different version was possible. Not rebellion, not abandonment, just a life with some room in it, some air." He stopped. "Seo Yeon sat across a table from me this afternoon and showed me what is being asked of me, and I looked at it all, the titles, the structures, the schedule, and I understood again that there is no version of that life with room in it." She watched him. "And the thing that—" He stopped, started again. "The thing that made it hardest was not the company, not even my father." His eyes came up to hers. "It was knowing that I was going to have to sit here tonight," he said, "and tell you that I leave tomorrow." The words hit her the way she'd known they would and hadn't let herself prepare for. "I leave tomorrow." She held very still. She held his gaze. She felt the full weight of the thing she'd admitted to herself this morning, settling into permanence, into the specific, painful shape of a door about to close. She thought about every ending, the gentle unravellings, the careful speeches, the accumulated tiredness of being someone people left. She thought about the 10 days in Japan that were supposed to fix something she was beginning to understand was never broken, just waiting. She thought, here it is again. She thought, of course. And underneath both of those thoughts, quieter and more honest than either. But this one is different, and you know it, and that's the worst part. She breathed in carefully. "Then we have tonight," she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression, a fullness, a gratitude, something else underneath both that she felt rather than named. "Yes," he said quietly, "we have tonight." They didn't go anywhere. She made dinner, simple, the kind of meal that was about occupation as much as hunger. And they sat at her kitchen table and ate and talked, and the evening moved the way the best evenings move, without either of them pushing it, finding its own pace and depth. He told her about his mother who had died when he was 12, and who had been the one person in his family who called things by their real names. She told him about her parents, her mother's laugh, her father's stubbornness, the particular love of two people who had chosen each other against every expectation and made it look, from the inside, completely inevitable. He listened the way he always listened, entirely, without waiting for his turn. At some point they moved to the sofa, the whiskey, the lamp throwing its small warm circle. London outside, doing what London did, going on indifferent and magnificent. She was aware of him beside her with every sense she had, the warmth of him along her side where the sofa brought them close, the rise and fall of his breathing, slow and steady, and occasionally, when the conversation moved somewhere true, slightly deeper, that fractional change she'd been cataloguing since a restaurant in Marylebone and had never stopped noticing. The sandalwood and cedar and warm skin settled now into the fabric of her evening as naturally as the lamplight. She was aware, too, of the hours moving, of midnight becoming one, of tomorrow being real. "Min-jun," she said at some point in the quiet. "Yes." "What you said this morning, I think you know." He turned his head. His face was close, the sofa, the lateness, the lamplight having reduced the distance between them to something that required a choice. "Yes," he said. "I do know," she said. He looked at her. The expression on his face was everything he never said, all of it present and undisguised, and it moved through her like the first warm day after a long winter, sudden and total, and making her realise how cold she'd been. He raised his hand, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who understood the weight of gestures. And he touched her face, just his fingertips, just the line of her jaw, so gently that it was almost a question. She turned into it slightly, the smallest movement, an answer. He looked at her for one long, still moment, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath, could see the dark detail of his eyes, could hear that slight deepening she'd been waiting for without knowing she'd been waiting. And then he pressed his lips to her forehead, softly, with such care that she felt it in her chest rather than her skin. He rested his forehead against hers. Neither of them spoke. The lamp burned. The city went on outside. She sat in the quiet circle of the evening and felt his breath and his warmth and the particular presence of someone who had chosen, even briefly, even just for tonight, to be exactly where they were. "I have to go," he said eventually. Against her hair, low and quiet and full of the weight of it. "I know," she said. He pulled back, looked at her, memorising, she thought, storing the way he'd stored her laugh and her name and the small careful things she'd offered him over weeks of Tuesdays and hotel corridors and rainy London streets. He stood, put on his coat, she walked him to the door. In the doorway he stopped, turned. "Zara," he said. One last time in that way he said it, both syllables, full weight, like something he'd decided deserved to be said properly. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "If I get on this plane tomorrow, you'll never hear from me again." The words hit her like cold water. Not cruel, nothing in him was cruel, but honest in the devastating way that only honesty can be. She understood what he meant. She understood the life waiting for him on the other end of that flight, the titles and structures and the schedule, the appropriate life in the rooms he hadn't chosen, closing around him the moment his feet touched that ground. She understood that Min-jun, once returned, would be someone else's version of him, and that version had no room for a woman he'd met on a plane who kept her phone number on a sticker on her earphone case. She looked at him, at this man in her doorway, at 1 a.m, at the tiredness and the honesty and the open, costly expression of someone who has said everything they know how to say. She didn't ask him not to go. She understood, better than most, that some lives are not simply walked out of. She reached out and touched his hand, once, briefly. "Then make sure you get on the right plane," she said. Something moved across his face, complex and quick and full. He held her gaze for one last moment. Then he turned and walked down the corridor toward the lift, his coat moving, his steps even and unhurried, and she stood in her doorway and watched him go and did not look away because she had promised herself she was done with looking away from things. The lift arrived. He stepped in. He looked at her once more through the closing doors, and then he was gone. She stood in her doorway in the quiet of the corridor for a long moment. Then she went inside, closed the door, pressed her back against it. She stood in the hallway of her flat and listened to the silence where he'd been, and the city outside being enormous and indifferent, and the small sound of her own breathing in the dark. And she thought, I should not have let him matter this much. And she thought beneath that, with the particular clarity that comes at 1 a.m. when you've run out of ways to lie to yourself, but I did, and it was real. And whatever comes next, that part was real. She pushed off the door, went to bed, lay in the dark with her eyes open, listening to London, waiting without meaning to see what kind of man he turned out to be. 7 months passed. Zara repainted her bedroom in March. A deep, warm white, not the bright clinical white of a room being cleared out, but the kind that held light differently at different times of day, that looked like cream in the morning and almost gold in the late afternoon. She'd chosen it from a sample card in a paint shop on a Saturday, standing in the aisle for 20 minutes while other people moved around her, and she'd known it was right in the way she always knew. Not because she could explain it, but because something in her settled when she held it up to the light. She'd done it herself. One weekend, radio on, windows open to the March cold, paint in her hair by midday. It was the most useful she'd felt in weeks. She did other things too. She finished the hotel project. Someone from Kang Industries Group had taken over on their side. A competent, pleasant man named James who approved everything she suggested and never once touched a material sample with his thumb. The hotel opened in April to good reviews. She stood in the reading room on the opening evening, a glass of champagne in her hand, and looked at the dark linen curtains falling in clean soft folds, the colour of deep water his choice, and allowed herself one moment of feeling the shape of his absence before she put it away and went to speak to a client. She was good at that by now, the putting away. In May, Sophie flew down from Edinburgh for a weekend, and they went to the Tate and ate too much at dinner and sat on Zara's sofa until 2 a.m. talking about everything, and at some point, around midnight, the second bottle open, Sophie said carefully, "Are you all right? Actually all right?" Zara thought about it honestly, the way she'd made herself think about things honestly since January. "Yes," she said. "Not entirely, but yes." Sophie nodded, didn't push. That was the thing about Sophie. She knew when the answer was sufficient. "He was different," Zara said after a moment. "I know," Sophie said. She'd never met him, but she knew. I'm not waiting," Zara said. "I want you to know that. I'm not living some suspended life waiting for a text. I've genuinely been—" She looked at her wine. "I've been getting on with things." "I know that too," Sophie said. She stopped. "I think about the embankment sometimes, walking by the river, the way he talked about architecture, the degree he never took." She turned her glass in her hand. "I think about the fact that somewhere in the world there's a version of him sitting in a boardroom being everything everyone else decided he should be, and it—" She stopped again. "It what?" "It makes me sad for him," she said. "More than it makes me sad for me." Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's how you know it was real." Zara looked at her. "When it stops being about what you lost," Sophie said simply, "and starts being about what they're living without." Zara looked at the wall, at the deep warm white she'd painted herself on a cold March Saturday. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it is." The summer was good. She took on more work than she needed and found she genuinely loved it, the particular satisfaction of a space transformed, of walking into a room that had been wrong and leaving it right. She took a long weekend in Lisbon in July with a book she'd been meaning to read for 2 years, and sat on a terrace in the evening warmth eating grilled fish and drinking cold wine, and felt, for the first time in a long time, like herself. Not a version of herself assembled for someone else's expectations, just herself unedited at a table in the sun. She did not download the dating apps, not from grief or loyalty or the particular suspended hope of someone waiting. She examined her reasons honestly enough to be sure of that. She just wasn't ready. Or she was ready but not interested. Or she was interested but not in anything that wasn't real, and real felt harder to settle for now that she knew what it felt like. She bought another plant and managed not to kill it, which felt like progress. August brought a heatwave that London handled with its characteristic mix of euphoria and complete infrastructural unpreparedness. She worked from home most of the month, her flat hot and bright, the windows open to whatever breeze the city offered. She had a new project, a restaurant in Shoreditch, the client young and specific and excited in the way of people who had saved for something and knew exactly what they wanted. She was happy. Genuinely, quietly, without asterisks. She had learned in the 7 months since a doorway at 1 a.m. that happiness was not a destination you arrived at and stayed. It was more like weather. You moved through it, and it moved through you. And the best you could do was notice it when it was there. She noticed it that August. She was careful to. September. She was in the fabric showroom in Clerkenwell, the same one, a different appointment, a different project, standing at the long table in the northern light when she stopped. She was holding a length of dark linen, the colour of deep water. She stood very still with it in her hands. She put it back on the table, moved along the shelf. She was fine. The message came on a Thursday evening in October. She was on her sofa with her laptop, reviewing a proposal, a cup of tea going cold on the table beside her. London outside was doing what London does in October, the dark coming earlier, the amber of the streetlight softer, the particular autumnal smell of wet leaves and chimney smoke that she had always, despite herself, found comforting. Her phone lit up. She glanced at it the way you glance at a phone when you're not expecting anything, reflexively, indifferently. She looked at the screen. She looked at it again. An unknown number. Korean area code. One message. I have been trying to find the right words for 7 months. I'm not sure I found them, but I find I can't wait any longer to try. She sat very still. The proposal on her laptop screen blurred slightly. The city outside went on, a bus, someone's music, the small ordinary night sounds of a street that did not know it needed to be quiet for this moment. Her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. She typed, Min-jun. Not a question, just his name, confirmation that she was here, that she'd received it, that the line was open. 3 dots appeared. I resigned from Kang Industries Group in June. It took 3 months to structure properly, to ensure the transition was right, that the people who needed protecting were protected. My father's condition has stabilised. He has someone capable beside him now, someone who actually wants to be there. She read it again. I've been in London since September. I didn't contact you immediately because I needed to be sure of what I was doing and why. I needed to know that I was making choices for real reasons, not reactions, not running from something, choosing towards something. The tea beside her had gone completely cold. She didn't notice. I've been here 6 weeks. I walk by the embankment sometimes in the evenings. I've been to the pub, the one near the river. I sat in the corner where we sat and had a whiskey and thought about what it would mean to simply ask. Another message, after a brief pause. I've been looking at architecture programmes. There's one at the Bartlett, part-time. I have an interview in November. She put her hand over her mouth. She sat on her sofa in her October flat with the lamplight warm around her and read those words again. Architecture programmes, the Bartlett, an interview in November, and felt something move through her that was too large and too warm and too thoroughly relieved to have a simple name. Something that had been held very carefully for 7 months, waiting without being told to wait, finally setting down its careful weight. "I know you said you weren't waiting," his next message read. "I hope you haven't been. You shouldn't have been. You should have been living, which I suspect you have been, because you are someone who lives regardless." She laughed, a short, helpless sound in the quiet of her flat. "But if there is any part of you that might want to have dinner, or a walk, or to stand in a wine shop and argue about Burgundy." A pause. "I would very much like to see you, Zara." She sat with the phone in both hands. Outside, October London went on, indifferent, magnificent, lit amber in the early dark. She thought about the Embankment, the pub, the showroom in Clerkenwell, and a length of dark linen and 2 people standing close enough to breathe the same air. She thought about a forehead pressed to hers in the lamplight and a hand touching her jaw with the care of something fragile and important. She thought about a man in a doorway at 1 a.m. saying, "If I get on this plane," not a goodbye, she understood now, but a question, the most honest question he knew how to ask. She thought about 7 months of a life lived genuinely, without suspension. The repainting, the Lisbon terrace, the good work and the good wine and the particular quiet happiness of someone who had decided to be present in her own life regardless. She thought, "I didn't wait." She thought, "And I'm still here." She typed, "I know a Japanese place in Marylebone, Saturday 7 o'clock, don't be late." She put the phone down, picked it up 10 seconds later because she couldn't help it. His reply was already there, a single line, "I'll be exactly on time." She set the phone face up on the table, not face down, not this time, and sat back against the cushions and let the smile come, fully, without managing it. The lamp burned. The tea was cold. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary Thursday evening, enormous and indifferent, and occasionally, improbably, the setting for something that mattered. She got there first. Of course she did. She'd always gotten there first. That was something she knew about herself, had always known. She arrived early to things because she liked the moment before, the anticipation of it, the brief suspended space when everything was still possible and nothing had been decided yet. The restaurant was exactly as she remembered, small and warm and amber-lit, each table its own quiet world, the smell of dashi and grilled things and the deep umami warmth of miso that hit you at the door like a welcome. She took the table near the back, the same one or close enough. She ordered water, wrapped both hands around it, watched the door. She was not nervous. She examined the feeling carefully, honestly, the way she'd been examining her feelings for 7 months. Not nervous, something else. The particular aliveness of a moment you've been moving toward without knowing you were moving toward it, arriving all at once. The door opened. He came in from the October cold. Dark coat, a few drops of rain on the shoulders. He found her immediately. No scanning the room, no hesitation. Just the quiet, direct recognition of someone who had already known exactly where she'd be. He looked different. The same and different. The tiredness she'd catalogued in February was gone, replaced by something she'd seen only in glimpses before. An ease. Not the performed ease of a man managing his own composure, but something more fundamental. The ease of someone who had chosen finally the room they were standing in. He looked, she thought, like a man who had found some air. He crossed the restaurant, stood across the table from her. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. In the amber light, with the warm restaurant sound around them, and October outside, and 7 months of living their separate lives between them and behind them, they looked at each other the way they had in a hotel corridor 9 months ago, with the specific mutual recognition of 2 people for whom coincidence had long since run out of explanations. "You're on time," she said. "I'm exactly on time," he said. She felt it then, the full, clean, unguarded thing she'd been carrying without naming, releasing itself at last like a breath held long past comfort. Not rescue, not completion, nothing so neat as either of those. Something more honest and more durable. The feeling of a person across a table who sees you, actually sees you, and has chosen, deliberately, freely, against considerable odds, to be exactly where they are. He sat down. He looked at the menu, then at her. "Should I order for both of us?" he said. She thought about a restaurant in February, about chopsticks and candlelight and his wrist crossing hers in the narrow space above the table, about breathing that changed in a quiet room. "Yes," she said. "I trust you." Something moved across his face, warm and precise and entirely his, the expression she'd catalogued since a first-class cabin over Russia and had never, in 7 months of careful, honest living, managed to file anywhere that wasn't central. He looked at the menu. She looked at him. And the evening began. The first time she'd met him, he'd been a stranger settling into the seat beside her on a flight home, contained and private and reading a financial document, not looking up, requiring nothing from the experience except the experience. This time he was exactly where he wanted to be. So was she.